So it's on the internet. We're already getting comments on YouTube.
I found just as many websites
Put it on
from
YouTube.
either side to prove either side.
Right?
So pick
And
one.
what was the whole point? Have an open mind. We don't know anything.
Absolutely.
That's the whole point of this. We don't know
Yeah.
any of this stuff,
Absolutely.
right? So overcoming addiction, we don't know anything about it. Just kidding.
No.
So I'm gonna start this off. I'm not an addiction expert. I don't claim to be. Obviously, I think none of us are experts, yet we're all experts. Who here has had an addiction to something at some point in their life? We all do. We all have, right? And we'll talk about this. This is a sliding scale. And most of the people, who's been here for over a year? Okay, how many food addictions have we worked through since you've been here?
It's crazy.
A ton, right? So, and there's other addictions that we've all worked through as we go through here. And what I want to do today is kind of have a different perspective about what an addiction is. More of a spiritual way of looking at it, I think, that helps us kind of reframe our mind and maybe makes it easier for us to tackle some of these addictions. Does that make sense? So, let's go through this. Anyone, what is an addiction? Anyone know what it means, the word addiction? It's Latin for the word for enslaved.
Oh, wow.
Right? And really, an addiction is a shortcut that we get for pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay?
And that makes you feel good.
Something that makes you feel good, but just like anything else in life, with a shortcut, what is there as a result of that? Usually there's a consequence. Okay? So when we use the word addiction, you can be addicted to things that are good for you, but most of the time when we say addiction, we're talking about things that we do to ourselves that we know aren't good for us. Make sense? Okay. Now let me ask you, is this a natural thing to have? This is like a reward pathway. You do something, you feel a reward, you want to go back for it. Is that a natural thing?
Yes. It's a response to something.
Yeah, why do we have this response in our body?
Because we want to feel good.
So, I want you guys to realize this. This is a natural thing. All animals have this too. Food, sex.
Was it the pleasure trap?
Yeah, because here's the deal. You want to have some reward system. If you go out and you find some food and you eat it and you get pleasure from it, it's a way to tell your brain, wow, we need this again. And you do it, and then you do it, and you do it. And every time you have this pleasure, it releases a hormone inside of you. And you know what hormone is called?
Dopamine.
Dopamine. This hormone dopamine is released. It makes you feel good. And you learn that behavior. So in nature, it's pretty useful to have that so you know how to reproduce and you know that you want to eat food. What we're going to find out, though, is there are addictive substances that end up releasing a lot more dopamine than you would get in nature. And that's when it starts to get bad. Make sense? Now, let me ask you this. Why would we have this process? Every week we talk about the innate wisdom of the body, how smart our body is, how intelligent it is. So how could we get addicted to something like cigarettes or something like alcohol? Why would the infinite wisdom of our body do that? So let me ask you a question. Anyone here ever smoked cigarettes? First time you ever smoked, what was your experience?
Terrible.
Yeah.
Why do we do it again? Dizzy, nauseous, ugh, tastes gross. How about the first time someone drank alcohol?
I don't even remember.
Right? I remember as a kid, sipping my dad's beer.
Me too.
And guess what? Did I love the taste of it?
No.
What was the infinite wisdom telling me?
Feel good.
No, the
No,
infinite wisdom was
don't
saying, hey,
have it.
this is not good for me. You smoke a cigarette, you cough, you hate the taste of it. So why do we keep going back to it?
Peer pressure.
We want to be cool, social
Social,
pressures,
social.
it's the thing to do. We want to get drunk in high school or college, whatever it is. Hang out with our friends. So guess what the infinite wisdom of your body does? It adapts. It's saying, oh, hey, if you're still going to put this cigarette in me, I better make use of it. So it actually produces almost like an antitoxin. So if you're putting this in, your body will say, okay, if you're going to do this, let me counterbalance it by making these chemicals and hormones. Make sense?
Wow.
Now what happens when you take this away?
They're still there.
You're still making these chemicals, and is your body in balance or out of balance?
Out of balance.
Out of
What do we call that? It's called withdrawal. Right? That's how smart your body is. So, little kid gets born into this world. We start giving them a whole bunch of meat, medication, dairy stuff, processed foods. How does your kid react?
Get sick.
They get sick, they get colicky stomachs, they get nauseous, they have constipation. What are we taught to do? And these are the signs of, like, wow, there's something going on inside. Like, your body doesn't like this food. But as a child, you can't speak up. And as parents, what are we taught to do when your child has a stomach ache?
Medicine.
We think, wow, there's something wrong with my child. So we go and we give them symptoms, but we don't change the food. Then what does your body learn to do after a couple years?
Yeah.
It adapts.
To the food.
And then if you stop eating that food later on in life, what happens?
Withdrawal.
Withdrawal symptoms, right? Try to put people on some detox, they're like, no way. Okay, so does this make sense? So the infinite wisdom of our body is so smart, it's actually working with us all the time. We just have to understand a lot of these addictions that formed in us, we weren't conscious of at the time, we had no control over as a kid. So we have to become conscious of this stuff. What are some things that we can be addicted to?
Sugar.
Sugar. So let's put them all together.
Food.
Food, right? There's many foods that we can be addicted to.
Cigarettes.
And by the way, all foods, right? Like we said, sugar. Sugar is 8 times more addicting than cocaine,
Cocaine.
right? Which cocaine is one of the most addicting things there is.
Well, that would be one.
Dairy.
Drugs.
Dairy is also very addicting. So
Yeah.
drugs,
Caffeine, exercise,
Alcohol.
work, sex,
sex.
TV, social media.
Video games.
Okay. How about work? Any workaholics here?
No.
Tobacco.
How about this?
Weed.
People. So we'll put that in drugs. We'll put tobacco in
Oh,
there.
put
Alcohol.
tobacco to drug.
Okay.
People.
Anything else?
I gotta
Guys,
go into the people one.
how about this?
What is it?
Anyone know what this means when you're addicted to a person?
People
Codependency.
Anyone heard of codependency before?
Yeah.
Means you need somebody to survive. That's what you think, and you're addicted to a person.
Yep.
Okay, it's not true, but this happens all the time. So, by the way, is anyone in this room addicted to any of these things, right? Or have been in the past? We all have at some degree. Okay, so we're all in this together. So, they used to treat this as separate issues. In fact, in the medical world, they list these as separate disease patterns. They'll say like addiction to drugs is different than addiction to alcohol, which is different than addiction to food. But what they're finding out is they're actually one and the same thing. They're all the same disorder, if you even want to call it a disorder.
Food is
I don't
different,
like
though.
calling it a disorder. What's that?
Isn't food different though? Because you gotta eat. I mean,
But it's about why we're eating.
What you're eating.
Okay, does that make
What's
sense?
Why you're eating, what you're eating.
Yeah, it's why you're eating it. So are you eating it just for the pleasure of it? Right? When we eat our snack foods late at night, are we eating it to survive? No, yeah,
Well,
it's just
maybe.
snacking on some food right there. Yeah, out of boredom. How many people notice that when you're doing like a juice cleanse or something like that? You're like, wow, I'm just really bored. I want to eat right now because I'm bored. Right? So it kind of distracts our mind, gives us that pleasure. Like,
It's more like an addiction to eating rather than an addiction to food.
right? Well, let's talk about how does these addictions form. Go ahead. You want to continue that thought?
Well, because I know that sometimes I just feel like eating. I'm not hungry, there's nothing I really want, I just want to eat.
Yes.
But it doesn't have anything to do with food.
Yes. It's like smoking a cigarette. How many people want to go outside and it's just like, wow, it's my interruption for the day, like my 5 minutes outside and have that cigarette.
Yeah,
You know, it's the same thing.
yeah.
We're just not realizing it. It's what we do to kind of distract our mind and to get this pleasure,
but
Right.
it's still a physical
So
addiction.
for me, it's more eating than food.
right? So here's the deal. All of these work the same way in our brain. And they all change our brain the same way. So let's talk about that. How does this form? So the number one, the first thing that happens during an addiction is number one, we have some type of pleasure. Whether that's drug, whether that's sex, whether it's alcohol, whether that's food, whether it's looking down at our cell phone at a YouTube video. That all does something. It all creates pleasure inside of us. And then we have this part of our brain just under our cortex that actually releases this hormone called dopamine. So you have a dopamine release. Now I want you guys to realize something. Different substances release different amounts of dopamine and how quickly they release it as well. So in nature, you have certain things that release dopamine. If you get some food, you get a little bit of a reward for it. Make sense? Okay. If you have sex, you get a little bit of a reward for it. Okay. You get that little pleasure center that goes off, and you're like, okay, life is good. The addictive things that we're talking about here, alcohol, drugs, Even the internet today, they're finding out what's so crazy about this is it's releasing anywhere from 2 to 10 times the amount of dopamine inside of your brain. And the more it releases, and the quicker it releases it, the more your body, you start to form this memory around it, and you want to go to it again. So the third part that happens is the more that you imbibe in it, what happens is you go from this part of your brain that says you like something, that starts to say, I need something. Okay? So it starts to change in your brain the more times you do it and the more often that you do it. Okay? After that, you have to realize because there's so much dopamine being dumped into your system, our nervous system isn't ready to handle that much dopamine. It can't. It gets bombarded. So you start to go through this phase called tolerance. What does tolerance mean?
You need more and more and more.
Yeah, if you keep taking that same amount. If I smoke 1 cigarette a day, pretty soon that 1 cigarette doesn't do anything for me. Then I need 2 cigarettes a day.
What about when you go reverse?
Well, let me finish this thought first, Prem, okay? So when we're talking about this tolerance, what's happening is your body is so used to all this dopamine being released in your system, your nervous system tries to correct it. And it does 2 things. It either reduces the amount of dopamine release you have, or the receptors on your nerves start to go away. It gets rid of the receptors so you can't take up as much. Make sense? So then how does your body correspond to that? Because you still want that fix. You still have that memory of, wow, I remember what that pleasure feels like. I want that pleasure again. Right? And you do anything you can to get that pleasure. So what do? More, more, more. So you have to start increasing what it was.
And what's the difference between the amount you're taking in and the strength of what you're taking in? Because a lot of people are like, oh, I've been smoking regular weed for so long, I had to move up to a stronger grade of weed
Right?
to get that high.
Yeah, it probably depends on like what's happening inside their dopamine receptor, like what's actually being released. Like, I don't know what that higher, form of weed does to them. I don't know if it could do one of 2 things: either release more or make it happen quicker too. Okay, so it's probably an individual depending on what we're talking about here.
So
Okay.
like the difference between beer and like liquor.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
Okay. So, and then you have to increase your amount in order to get the same reversal. So this is the addictive patterns that happen. But next, and this is pretty simple, right? You guys understand that, right? The next question is, what is the actual cause, though? So here's the deal. You take 2 people who, and you give them some beer. One person, for some reason, might have more of that addictive personality. The other person doesn't, right? Right? If you smoked a cigarette before, some people can smoke a cigarette, no problem. Other people smoke a cigarette and they want another one, they want another one, they want another one. So what's the difference between all these people? And there's different ways to look at this. Number 1, I like to look at it like a scale. Like I said, raise your hand if you've been addicted to something in your life. We're all addicts of some form. We're all together on this. Now there are some people, though, who are super regimented, who for some reason there's no pull that way. Those things don't pull them at all that way. And there are other people who literally they can't even walk into, let's say, a bar. Because as soon as they walk in, they're going to be drawn into it. Okay, and there's different ways to look at this. We can look at it at a very physical, chemical level, or we can look at it at a very spiritual level. So let's go through both. Psychological. This used to be the norm, that it was a psychological disease. That you had low willpower, it was a psychological thing, and that some people just suffer from this. And it's almost like a mental disorder. Guess what? They found out this is completely wrong. But there are people who still treat addiction this way. Okay? Now, is it genetic? There is a gene for addiction. And we're going to talk about a guy over here named Jay Holder. And you're going to be blown away about the success he's had with addiction, okay? Who talks about treating this like a genetic disorder. Now, you guys all know my take on genes, right? Are things genetic or not?
No.
2% are genetic. So what does he mean by this? It means this. There is a gene that people have that make them more predisposed to have dysfunction in their dopamine release. So it means this. It means if you don't release enough dopamine normally, so what happens? You have to seek out more dopamine by other things, or else you're going to be really depressed in life. So there are certain people who have these genes that they don't feel good. They feel depressed all the time. They feel anxious because they're not producing enough dopamine. So they have to do extreme things to get it. By the way, I forgot over here, gambling is also an addiction too.
Adrenaline.
Yeah, the thrill of winning, right? And winning big. So, does that mean if you have this gene that you are destined to become an addict?
No.
No. What does epigenetic mean? And remember what epigenetic means?
Environment.
So epigenetic means this. Remember, your gene, so you have your cell. Inside of your nucleus of your cell is your DNA. These are all your genes. And genes are just little blueprints on how your body should run. Make sense? So let's talk about it. We'll review it real quick. My eye and my heart have the same exact DNA. Same genes, same blueprints. Do my eye and my heart look exactly the same?
No.
Does my heart need to know how to make brown pigment?
No.
Right? Absolutely not. So why doesn't my heart make that? Because those blueprints are wrapped up and put away and not used in my heart. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have blueprints on how to make these genes to break this whole thing down, it doesn't mean that they're open and your body is making those genes. Yes, go ahead, Joey.
Real quick, like, this is a side question, like, is that why some people are born with, like, extra, like, limbs and stuff? Is it because those genes open up, like, by accident?
Well, that could be a lot of different things. It's usually mutations. Usually that's because there's something in the environment that's messing with their DNA or some type of medication.
Environment.
Right? Yeah, so let's go further into this. These epigenetics, okay? So what it means is this, is you might have a blueprint that says, hey, you can't make as much dopamine, but for most of us, that is wrapped up and shoved away. What takes that out and opens that up is the environment that you put it in. So, if you're in a healthy environment and you're giving your body healthy foods and you're living a healthy lifestyle, your body actually takes those blueprints and shoves them away and you never make those proteins. So those genes never express themselves. But now, if you live a very unhealthy life, you eat bad foods, you don't work out, you don't exercise, you feel disconnected in life, your body will pull out those genes and actually start making those proteins. And those genes will be used. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you, how does this change our approach about addiction? What's more important? First of all, we know it's not psychological. When it's psychological, what was the solution?
Drugs.
Medication. Do you guys know how most addiction clinics run? I don't want to say most, but a lot of them run.
They get you hooked on something different, like
Yes.
Suboxone or different types of.
Absolutely. I had a buddy who, his friend had addiction problems, right? Really heavy drug addiction problems. Worked for a very wealthy family, and they paid for him to go to rehab. One of the best rehab centers, supposedly, one of the most expensive, I should say, in Palm Beach County. Brought him there. Their solution was to literally drug the guy up so he couldn't do anything to himself. They literally put him on heavy medications. They went out, they got him fast food. They just would ask the people there, what do you want for food? They would just go out and get him fast food, and that was it. That was the treatment. Drug them until they can't put the stuff in them for 30 days, and then when they're done, okay, hopefully you don't go back.
Most of them aren't like that, though.
Yeah, okay. Most of them are, but that's an extreme example, but that is how some of these clinics run. Okay?
'Cause
Yes.
they used to-
But there's also like so many addicts that are in recovery are weaned off of one addiction, but then they go crazy with another. Like
Yeah.
I know a bunch of recovering alcoholics who now chain smoke cigarettes and drink a bunch of coffee and eat a bunch of food.
Yes.
It's like they never deal with the underlying
5
issue.
minutes.
Yes, 100%. Prem, did you want to make a comment too? About other addiction things? Because you're more than welcome to.
They used to like treat, okay, like in the early days of, say, Alcoholics Anonymous, they would treat the addiction with orange juice and Karo syrup to bring the people off. I mean, now they treat it with lithium.
Right.
So,
With the
I mean,
what?
that's what the start, the detox is. But then
Right.
once they get into recovery, then it's a different,
Right.
because it's when the.
So you're separating. You're saying first is detox.
Well,
You get
it's when-
off of the stuff.
right.
You get the stuff out of your system.
And if you look at the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a passage in there that says, once a spiritual malady is
Yes.
healed. Everything else falls into place.
Prem, please hold on to this, and we're going to talk about this. I want you to speak about it too, if you don't mind, okay? Because this will be a big part of this
What
too.
did she say? I couldn't
She was just talking about, like, for example, with Alcoholics Anonymous, talking about kind of the spiritual way
Oh.
of dealing with it. And that's what we're going to talk about. When I say this and I say general stuff, we're talking about kind of like the medical approach to like what generally... Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Sorry, I got a problem with this. Okay, so one of the doctors has said that alcohol addiction is really just an addiction to sugar. So if you're going to have donuts and juice, that's just feeding the addiction.
Well, it's interesting, because then you have someone like Arnold Ehret, you know, the naturopath in the early 1900s. He talked about alcohol addiction. This is really interesting. He said if you eat meat and you're a strong meat eater, you're going to be addicted to alcohol. Because the infinite wisdom would actually crave it because it helps break down the meat. And if you stop eating meat, your alcohol cravings go away.
That's something.
And I've seen that personally happen with people. So it's like, wow, how much of this stuff do we really don't know about too? It's like, I'm sure there's some regard to that about that sugar cravings. You know what I mean?
There's no sugar in meat.
Right? Well, yeah. But it's funny though. But I think it was more about the body knew that it would help break it down. So like your body starts seeking out stuff. If you're gonna put something inside of you that turns to a glue, sticky type stuff inside of you, the infinite wisdom might know, wow, there's maybe something that I can take that will help break that down inside of my gut. You know, kind of like you see dogs go out and eat grass. It's like they just know intuitively it's not for their nutrition. They're doing it because they want to actually vomit up some stuff.
And the sugar and alcohol is different also. It has a different effect on your body.
Yeah.
Kills your liver.
Yeah, for sure. So, let's move ahead here. And again, guys, I'm not an expert in this, but I want you to understand this concept here. When we understand it's okay, there's a genetic component to it, meaning that it's epigenetic. So, what we do, our lifestyle and the environment we're around plays a very, very important role as to whether somebody becomes addicted or not. Epigenetic means your environment dictates what genes are expressed, and these genes actually might dictate if you're going to be an addict or not. So we need to look at the environment and change the environment somebody's in. Make sense? Okay. Number 3, let's talk about the spiritual components of this, because I think this is where it starts to get really fun. In fact, I was writing this on the board. I was right here, and I had this gentleman come in. And he says, an addiction. He's like, I've been reading a lot about addiction. I'm like, really? And he's like, you know what it is? I'm like, no, what is it? And he said, it's when you're drained of the spirit, and you have to seek that connection somewhere else. And it's so interesting, because I didn't even write this part on the board yet, which is what we're going to talk about. Now, we do talk about something called sacred contracts. Who here has done their sacred contracts? Who's done their archetypes? Right? So sacred, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, what it's based on, we do this one thing here where we kind of find out your gifts that you have on this world and what you're supposed to do. But it's based on this work by Carl Jung and then Carolyn Mace, which says this, that before you're born here, that your spirit makes a contract of lessons that you want to learn while you're here and things you want to grow through. And one of the main ones is the addict archetype. So it's saying this, some people before, and whether you believe it or not, it's a fun way to look at it, I think. When you come here on this planet, some people say, wow, I want to work through this one lesson. And it's the lesson of addiction. Okay? And as a result, if you work through that lesson, you become the master of it. So think of it kind of like an on-off switch. When it's off, you're an addict. If you work through it, you become the master of it. So for example, if anyone's ever battled with alcohol addiction before and they won the battle, they'll say, wow, I can conquer anything because I conquered that. It's like conquering your own demons. Does that make sense? But here's really what it comes down to. I talk about this in a couple talks right now. Think about it this way. You have this switch. You have your bodily desires, the lower forces asking for stuff all the time. Then you have the spirit up here, which is your true highest self. Peace, love, joy, everything that's perfect. Your soul is the light switch that gets to toggle between which one you're listening to. Your soul is your emotions and your free will. Does that make sense?
Your conscience and your free will.
Yes, exactly. So your soul is always listening to either the body or the spirit, and he gets to make that choice to what it listens to. Okay? Think about somebody who takes this sacred contract. In most of us, we might be able to hear both of those equally and kind of toggle back and forth depending on what we're choosing. Think about somebody who chose an addict archetype, is they hear this very loud. In fact, so loud that it drowns out the voice of the spirit, and they can't hear it. Does that make sense? So, this is the sacred contract that they have to learn. They have to learn when somebody has an addict archetype. So if you're somebody who's suffered with addictions your whole life, where you get easily addicted to work, to the internet, to drugs, to alcohol, to smoking, to any of these things, to food, it's understanding this relationship and understanding, wow, if this is you and this is so loud that your body has to go through it, you learn to box this stuff in and create almost like a very organized, systematized life. So you would know, like, wow, just like the person who knows, like, wow, I know if I go into a bar, I'm going to drink. So guess what? They are so organized and systematized, they never go into a bar. They just become so intelligent and conscious about it, they never let this have the opportunity. If you're a cigarette smoker, you never go to the same stores that you would buy a cigarette in, and whatever it is, you create your little system. Make sense? My dad is an addict in his highest potential, in his archetypes. My dad's never suffered from an addiction, maybe a work addiction, that's it. Right? But my dad is like one of the most OCD guys ever. He wakes up, he's got his regimen, he follows every day, and it's like his protection. Does that make sense? So that's one way to do this, right? I used to do this spiritual teaching. It was a little practice called Subud. And it was really interesting because they talk about it the same exact way. The way they talk about it was that there are different forces or levels of consciousness on this planet. So the lowest is the material force, followed by plant, and then animal, and then human, then what was called like a sainthood, and then angel, and then God itself, the very top. Guess where we should be? Where the human is, right? But what this would teach was that these forces there are material forces. There are people who, these animal, plant, material forces are very real. They create these forces out, and they can kind of come above you and come into you. And if you don't have some kind of spiritual practice, if you don't go to, let's say, church, you don't just connect with God, these things can overwhelm you. So, for example, if you get a lot of animal force in you, you start to have animal consciousness. What do you think that looks like? Very primal, right? Very aggressive, lots of anger, very sex-seeking, makes sense? And that's what starts to happen to somebody. And they talk about, for example, if somebody has a lot of material forces coming, somebody who wants to, the only thing they think about is like money and cars and all this stuff. What's that?
Hoarding.
Yeah, hoarding is a very good example of it. You ever talk to somebody and it's like talking to a wall?
Yeah.
Like you're talking and they're just like not even paying attention to you, or like they're looking at you but you know they're not listening? Somebody who's a material consciousness. So think about it this way, just like spirit and body, we're here at this level. We have these higher forces and these lower forces always talking to us and letting us know, hey, you can go this way or you can go this way. This was like the easiest thing for me to understand is, who here has done some water fasting before? Anyone notice after they water fasted how different the relationship is to food? You start to really separate those two, don't you? You know, and there's been times now where it's like, I can feel my mouth craving something, and I go to pick it up, and the energy of it is like, whoa, and like there's something in me that's like, put this thing down right now. It's my spirit talking to me. So you know what we're talking about, just munching stuff at night. Are we conscious or unconscious when we're doing that?
Unconscious.
We're unconscious. What forces are asking us to do that? These lower forces. Make sense? So it's going to pull us downward. As opposed to when we're conscious and we can feel into that, and we're actually tuning in with our body. You guys ever do this before you eat something? You just check in with yourself. You just take a moment, feel it, like just kind of pray over the food, feel it, and then ask your body, how am I going to feel with this? You'll have a total answer. Make sense? So you start doing this with all of these things, and it starts to become really, really easy. So the other approach with it is understanding, wow, we really want to start separating these two. We really want to start listening to this more. And this is probably, Prem, if you want to talk a little bit about it and what their approach is.
Well, it is all about the path to God.
Right.
You know, it's totally the path to when you work through the 12 steps, it's all leading you to God, and the thing of it is, whatever God is to you,
right.
Whatever your higher power is, it could be a tree, it could be nature, it could be whatever.
Right.
But whatever that is for you. And then, like I said, it says that once the spiritual malady is healed inside, then everything else falls into place.
Right.
But it's like what she was saying about other addictions, people along the path, because it's like the only way I can think of it is like a well. Okay, you've got a gusher, an oil well, you got a gusher coming up here, you put a lid on that, say alcohol, and then you'll have one with cigarettes or coffee or whatever, and it's still, it still has to do with the spiritual malady.
It's still the body asking for stuff.
Yeah, it's
and you can start to feel that, correct?
Right.
So like if you're going into a drug rehab, for hardcore drugs, and then instead you go outside, you smoke cigarettes every time you have that impulse, it's still your body calling for stuff. You're not getting into that spiritual zone.
There was an addiction center up north where I saw people go to prison because they couldn't let go of cigarettes because it was a non-smoking facility, and they said if people are going to fall apart, we want them to fall apart while they're here, not when they're outside of here. So
right.
the addiction was so strong that they would actually go back to prison before letting go of the other addiction.
Wow.
That's how strong it was.
Wow.
But it was still had to do with the spiritual malady because they were young. It's like being a baby in something. They were young because I believe if you look at some of the documentaries or the movies on how AA got started, you can see that there was a spiritual awakening. They talk about the spiritual awakening. It can be sudden or it can be gradual.
Right.
So
well,
it's divinely inspired.
I think what it all comes down to, guys, is what we talk about every week. Like, what heals your body? Is it something from outside of you or something from within you?
Yeah.
Right? And the same with love. Where does love come from? Is somebody else or within you? Always within us. We're so complete within us. So it comes down to looking within and realizing, wow, we're so complete. Or do we give power to things outside of us? When you're a smoker, how much power are you giving to that cigarette? Yeah. So there's some really cool stories of people who've looked at it, and we'll talk about some affirmations that you can do. But people who look at it and stop giving it power. Say, oh wow, all the desire, all of the want, all the feeling good, where is that coming from? Is it coming from that material object? No, you're creating all those feelings inside of you. It's not the object. Make sense? All this stuff's coming from inside of us all the time. So where's all the power? Inside of us. Right? If you love somebody else, is it that person that's creating those feelings? No, it's all the stuff inside of us that's actually being created. So do you need that person? If somebody you love actually passes away, do you not have that love anymore? Did it go away? It's still there, and you can still feel that energy, and you can still think of that person and still have that love. Make sense? So it's like, wow, we don't need to be addicted to the person. It's not the person that did any of it. It's all the spirit within us that's creating all of this stuff. So it's really meditating and praying on these things, these concepts that really start to help us. So dealing with addictions, the standard success rate, 18,000 clinics in the United States. Anyone know what the standard success rate is of overcoming addiction after 30 days? It's about 46%. However, they have a retention rate of 60%. So what that means is of the 46% of people who are healed, 60% of them will stay healed. Another 40% will go back into it. So long term, not very good, right? So this approach that we're going to talk about, Jay Holder, he actually does 3 things. He didn't do all of these. He actually does a couple things. He does this thing called auricular therapy, which is kind of like a little bit of acupressure points on the ear. He does a nutritional approach, and he does chiropractic. Okay, he's actually in Miami is where he started. He's got addiction clinics all over the world now. Guess what his success rate is? 86%. Guess what his retention rate is? 100%.
Wow.
Pretty successful, right? We're gonna say, how does like all this stuff work? So this would be my recommendation of starting to do this stuff. And again, I'm no expert. I know some of these things, based on Jay Holder's work, is just profound. I know with a lot of people coming here, just the chiropractic alone. And Tony Robbins is a big fan of chiropractic as well because it changes your nervous system so radically. It's a really good time to start breaking your habits, right? Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
You did it the first time I saw you.
What'd I do? I did
Change
nothing.
the first adjustment, you did it. My addiction was gone.
Wow, pretty cool, huh?
Yep.
Wow.
It's really interesting. I had another patient, maybe like 8 months ago come in, and she had actually suffered from alcohol issues. And she was actually a really clean eater. Adjusted her, went home, she went to the bathroom and had parasites come out of her.
Oh my God.
She came back in, she said, I didn't want to drink since that first adjustment. Her alcohol problems just went away.
Yeah.
So we talk into this too. A lot of it's gut health, which we'll talk about right here. But essentially, number one, the first thing I think we have to do is be aware. And what I mean is be aware of the spirit versus body. Does that make sense? Understand that when things are pulling, you have to be aware of this stuff. When you're getting that impulse to smoke or to drink or to do this, what's asking you to do that?
Do you also need an awareness that you have an addiction? Because many people that are addicted don't acknowledge that they're addicted.
Right? Yeah, well, you might, but I think to me that only comes with grace, right? It's like there are so many things that we're addicted to that we don't know, and then one day it's like, whoa, looking back at it.
But the ones that are really harmful, that keep you from living your life effectively.
Right? Go ahead, Bram.
Well, the key too is, like I know, like with the 12 steps, the key is helping another human being. I mean,
Right.
that's the biggest thing to get out of yourself and to help someone else.
Right?
Because it helps you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, it's like really starting to focus on this more and more. Like really start doing some practices that get you in contact in it. So what are some practices that we can do to start being aware of this? Because I think once you open yourself up to this concept of, wow, there is a higher force that can go inside of me and lead me along the way, whatever you believe in. You know, that's not what this talk's about, but it's like, wow, just understand there are forces that are lower that are going to pull you down. There's no right or wrong. You can go any way you want to. You know, but one is of suffering and one is damaging your body. One is of lightness and fun, right? So, what are some practices that we can do to be in this more?
Meditation. Mindfulness. Grounding.
Right.
Grounding.
Breathing.
Right. Breathing. How about fasting?
Definitely.
That's next.
Now it's going to continue into detoxifying. What are we detoxifying from?
Dopamine.
Right? So we're detoxifying from a lot of different things. There's different ways to look at this, okay? Number one, let's look at it from an epigenetic standpoint. We're getting ourselves, we want to do it because we want to make our body as clean, as healthy as possible. We want to create a really healthy environment so that these genes are closed up and put away. Go ahead, Shirley.
Can you be addicted to something really good, or are all addictions bad for you? What if you're addicted to something like giving everything away that you own, or doing everything for other people?
Yeah.
That can be an addiction. Is that a
Yep, absolutely. You can be addicted to good. You can be addicted to
like going
exercise.
to church 24 hours a day, or
So as soon as it starts to become bad for you and damaging to you, then it becomes not an addiction. Okay? When
It's
it's your
that
lower
line.
forces that are doing it, if it's your ego that's making you do that stuff, it's not a good thing. Right? So we detoxify by doing, again, fasting, juicing, even eating raw. And there are people, I don't know if you know this, people who've just done a juice cleanse who've gotten over their addictions of drugs. Gotten over their addictions of alcohol just by juicing. I don't know if you guys have experienced this before. Anyone like a big coffee drinker? Anyone do like a juice cleanse and all of a sudden their like cravings for some of that stuff go away? You know? I know people who've done juice cleanses and they don't want to drink at all. They're alcohol drinkers and their cravings completely go away after doing it. So just doing this stuff alone and cleansing out the body, a lot of those addictions completely start to go away. Then we start talking about real nutrition. And again, I mentioned Arnold Ehret before, but Arnold Ehret would say things like alcohol abuse and alcohol addictions come from us eating bad foods. We eat bad foods, we also start to get bad bacteria in our gut. Was anyone here for our parasite talk?
Yes.
That was the best one, wasn't it, Lauren?
Oh my God.
That one had videos and a whole bunch of cool stuff.
I'm not coming to that.
That one's a gross one. It was really gross. But how much do the bacteria in our gut control our brain? For that one woman, literally, it was making her an alcoholic. The bacteria in her gut were craving these things. Okay? This animal consciousness was craving this stuff, not her own. Okay? So when we start to eat clean and eat healthy, we start to regain our self back, and it actually makes that voice so much clearer and cleaner. If you guys are on this path, it's really, really easy to start hearing this more and more and more. Make sense?
It's about waking up.
What's that?
About waking up.
Yeah, it's about waking up.
Coming out of the sleep.
Yeah, becoming more and more conscious. How does chiropractic help with it? Number one, we all know it helps with your nervous system. And by the way, they do know with addiction people who have addiction issues, they're missing some nutrients, they're missing some amino acids. So by having a healthy, balanced diet with raw foods, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, and even adding a little bit more healthy plant-based protein in there will get you those amino acids, okay? So things like tempeh and soy and stuff like that as well. Alright? Chiropractic, so what Jay Holder also discovered was this. Remember I said dopamine's released where? In the brain. What they found is that, wow, it's actually way more than that. Dopamine, there's just as much dopamine in your spinal cord as there is in your brain. So your dopamine pathways are dependent also on your spinal cord, and what's protecting that spinal cord? Your spine. So what Jay Holder actually discovered, because he's a chiropractor by trade, by the way, what he discovered is that through specific types of chiropractic care, it opens up the amount of dopamine you're releasing. So a lot of people with addiction issues who aren't producing much dopamine, you give them adjustment, what happens to the dopamine levels? They rise up magically. That's why he has such great results with it, because he's looking at it from a whole body approach. And again, your nervous system is what's dictating what genes are expressed. Make sense? So when you get an adjustment, and by the way, it totally changes your nervous system. Anyone here ever heard of Joe Dispenza?
Yeah.
So Joe Dispenza he's also a chiropractor, but he's really famous, especially on YouTube. He was in What the Bleep Do We Know, pretty famous movie.
I think he was in The Secret What?
That was John DeMartini, who's very similar.
Joe Vitale.
Joe Dispenza and Joe Vitale, who's not a chiropractor though. But what he is known for was he has a book called, I think it's called Evolve Your Brain. And it's understanding this, as we get older, our brain gets certain pathways etched into it. Right? So what ends up happening is we learn certain traits. Like when you wake up, you do the same routine every day, typically. Makes sense? And you drive to work the same way, and you do the same stuff every day. And some people do this for 40, 50 years. So your brain becomes really plastic. Doesn't move very much. So what he says is actually kind of creepy. 95% of your day is etched in. You're programmed. 95% of the day you're unconscious, you're just doing no thought about it, no consciousness to it, you're just in your programs. You look at your phone, it's just an unconscious program that's inside of you. Right? What you do when you wake up is unconscious. You have 5% of your day is when you can start making conscious decisions. So what you start to do with those 5% of the day that you're conscious is you start using that 5% to actually dictate what you want changed in your life. You start focusing and visualizing on what you want different. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But what's so amazing about a chiropractic adjustment is that plasticity, when you make that first adjustment, completely shakes up. And because you're shaking that whole plastic up, now is the best time ever to change those programs that you've had. So after your first adjustment, like Pat is saying there, one adjustment, boom, addiction gone. How does that happen? It's because you're making such an input into the nervous system right then and there. You're jostling everything up. And if you want to make those changes, you do it right then and right there. Pretty cool, right? It's a good time to do detoxes. Number 5 is affirmations. Dr. Sid Williams, one of my biggest mentors, he has a whole story. And if you guys want it, I could probably find it. It'll take me a while to find it, but I can. It's his story about how he broke his cigarette addiction. And it goes back to not giving. Dr. Sid Williams, he started the school I graduated from. He was like a huge chiropractic pioneer. Just a really brilliant guy. But what he did was he would do. Yeah, sure. Dr. Sid Williams.
You would have never gotten that from the way you said the name.
Sid Williams.
I have no idea what you just said.
Sid Williams.
Yeah.
So Dr. Sid Williams.
Oh, thank you.
Sidney E. Williams. What he did was he would do constant affirmations over again about these cigarettes. And he would give them no power. He'd look at them and he would just tell it, you have no power over me. I get nauseous even looking at you. You disgust me. And then he'd go and he'd light one up and every day, you disgust me, and you try to invoke me, you make me nauseous. Oh, smoke some more. All of a sudden, one day he gets up, looks at it, guess what happened? He got nauseous, never smoked another cigarette again.
Isn't that still giving it power
What's that?
though? Go ahead.
How is that giving you power?
Because you're giving it power to tell that it makes you nauseous.
Right? Well, if you want to think of it that way, then sure. I mean, you can do any affirmation that you want with it. You know, you can do your own positive affirmations and say, all the power and all the joy I get come from within me. You give me nothing. You can do that and it will work as well. Go ahead, Rick.
Would that be something like psyching your mind up to do something?
Yeah, in a way. It's kind of a way of covering it or changing your programming, like we're talking about with Joe Dispenza. You're changing those pathways you have of reward pathway, you're starting to say, not a reward pathway, you know, make me sick, you make me nauseous.
Right, that's what he was programming himself to quit.
Yeah, exactly.
All the negatives of it.
Well, that's
Does
like
it mention anything on the anger and the irritability?
So that's going to be more of like the withdrawal. What will help a lot with that, honestly, is the detoxing. And doing saunas and doing juice cleanses. So like when you're doing it, it's amazing if you do a juice cleanse and you just do that over and over again. And what he did was he didn't actually stop the smoking of the cigarette while he was doing the affirmations. He waited until it like actually just took hold in his mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like instead of withdrawing, a lot of people will stop and pull themselves away, and like he was not doing that. So there's a really funny story where he was at a seminar and he was doing this whole thing where he was saying, I don't eat anything where blood is coursed through it, and you know I don't eat meat and and going on and on. And then he went to a restaurant and he's eating a steak. And he was like, and these two kids walked in from the seminar and saw him eating the steak and thought he was this huge liar. And he was like, they didn't get it. In my mind's eye, I didn't eat meat. Like he was training himself. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
He was speaking as if he didn't eat meat because that's how you do it.
He wasn't ready to give up eating meat yet.
Yeah, but in his mind's eye, he wasn't a meat eater. So the way this guy lived his life, and by the way, he did this with his practice too. He would tell people like, oh, I'm seeing like 1,000 people a week right now. And that's what he would say, even if he was seeing like 300. And he would say it like it was real, and then all of a sudden that would start to
it's
happen.
a law of attraction.
Well, and he was saying, you know, it was a vision from God for him of what came into him, what he was supposed to say. So he lived his life, he walked by faith, not by sight. So his whole life was like literally in his mind's eye, like a vision from God, and he would just literally say, like, this is my life, and speak it into existence. And walk in total faith the whole time. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's why like he would say, like, I don't smoke cigarettes. I'm not a smoker. And he would say stuff like that when he smoked. And people would be like, oh, what a liar. But in his mind's eye, no, I'm not a smoker. In his world, that's reality. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amber.
I worked at a place where, for a very long time, where it was like 99% of the people that started working in my department were all recovering addicts. And I am the complete opposite. I'm what's called a non-addictive personality. And there was things that when I wanted to quit something, I have no consequences to, you know, my things because I can control those addictions. But there was something I wanted to stop. And one of the things that I realized that was, if I continue to fight with myself, I'm a very strong personality. If I continue to fight with myself and say, no, don't do this, then I, the bad, is going to win over the good. So one of the things that I used to do with the people that were my friends, that ultimately became my friends, that were addicts, one of the things I used to tell them is instead of trying to fight that urge, what you should do is put it off for the moment. Like I'm going to do my laundry first. You might not be doing your laundry. You might be sitting at work. But displace, say to yourself that you're going to do something else first. So don't tell yourself you're not going to do it, because you're going to spend 99% of the time trying to fight yourself saying, yeah, I want it though, and who's going to win. So what you do is you take that element of addiction away by not fighting with yourself, by not having that pull, and you put it off. And I guess that goes to what this gentleman was saying about psyching yourself into believing a certain thing. It's only for the moment. You take that away for the moment, that strong urge, gee, I want to watch that TV program, but I have to do my homework instead. So I'll watch the program later. I'm not going to watch the TV program. I have to do my homework first. I'll watch it later. So you're still in control. You're putting yourself in control without putting yourself in a fighting position.
Well, and I think it's about loving yourself too, and that's the last one here. It's seeing the gift of it. Remember, guys, it's
one day at a time.
Well, it's understanding this. This is the spirit. If you think about it from a spiritual concept, if you have an addictive personality, think of it in terms of archetypes. It's a gift that you came here with. And the gift is to be like, wow, your gift as an addict is that you can feel that urge better than anybody else. You can feel the pull of the lower forces better than anybody else on the planet. And because of that, you can be the most prepared person on the planet and actually have a very organized, structured, beautiful life because of that, when you've mastered that, when you become really conscious of that, when you fill yourself up with that spirit enough. Does that make sense? So just know there's no such thing as a bad archetype. If you have the addict, it's a lesson to work through, and it's a blessing to work through. And when you work through it, you're going to have the confidence that, wow, I can take care of anything. I can crush it. Because my spirit is always stronger than the lower forces. Make sense? Awesome. Just remember that and love yourself through it. Guys, any questions or comments? Yeah, Laura.
What do you think about an addict who doesn't have an addict archetype?
What do you mean?
Like if someone's an addict but it's not one of their archetypes.
Oh, interesting.
What did you say?
What about somebody who has an addiction? Like who has an addiction, you mean?
Well,
but doesn't have an addict archetype?
Like an addictive personality but doesn't have an addict archetype.
But isn't addicted? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know, it's just not one of the archetypes.
Environment.
I don't know what you're saying.
So, I guess I would say this still pulls. So the addict archetype is just somebody who really hears this. You can still be an addict because, like I said, remember, it's a scale. So we're all an addict of some sort. Every single one of us, right? I'm addicted to TV. I'm addicted to the internet. I'm sure people. We've all been down those roads. So the lessons are still the same. It's just becoming more and more in contact with this over and over and over again. Does that make sense? And then doing this other stuff. I know for me it's been a journey. The more I do this stuff, wow, the pull it's so much easier and easier and easier to hear the difference between the two and to make the right decision. In fact, there's a certain point you get to, at least I'm finding, where it's so hard to choose the wrong thing. I don't even want to call it the wrong thing, but to choose the lower over the higher because the pull is so strong upward. Make sense? Hope that helps.
The distinction addiction for me was always something that interferes with your life. If you want to watch a lot of TV, you're not necessarily addicted to it, unless it interferes with your life. But you didn't say that anywhere. You're just saying, well, we're all addicted to something, but it's really not an addiction unless it interferes with your life.
See, I would argue, though, that you might be so unconscious to how it is interfering with your life. Because you can get real comfortable just sitting and watching TV versus look at your archetypal wheel. There's so many things you can be doing out in so much more joy.
But that's my life.
For sure.
It may look like that to you on the outside, but if it isn't interfering with my life,
so
then it's not what I would call an addiction.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but just consider this though too. That could also be somebody who is on cocaine. They could just be like, well, this is my life. Like, it's not interfering with anybody else.
Yeah, well, it probably is interfering with their relationship and their family, and it is interfering with their life. The fact that they don't realize it, that's what I said before. What about people who don't admit that they have an addiction?
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. It's harder to say with TV and the phone.
But everything isn't an addiction. We're not all. I don't agree. I just don't agree with that. Okay. Everything is an addiction.
Go ahead, Richie.
There's some people that have gone on a vacation from their phone or something like that, and they can see it from the other side, and they can realize, oh my God, I was doing this all the time, and it's so much nicer to be out in the woods.
Right? Or like, hey, let me take a week off of TV. If there's none of that, like, oh my God.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you're not addicted, but if there is that, oh my God. John, do you have a comment?
Just, I wanted to know, is there a difference between the male and female? And the reason I bring it up is because this testosterone plays a part of it. Because Sue is much more intuitive than I am, and I think women in general are much more intuitive. And when it comes to our kids, she knows what they're doing without even talking to them. She just knows.
Right.
And she nailed the kids, you know. They call on the phone. You're doing this. Yeah. And she knows. Me, I don't know. I'm a guys are so recovered. Is there a male female testosterone?
We're more the animal consciousness down here. I don't know. That's a really great question. I'm sure there is some play, and I wonder how much of that is a spiritual aspect too. But I could definitely look into that for sure. I don't know. Go ahead, Joe.
Alright, sorry. So I just want to share something really quick. So I had a little bit of an addiction that I didn't know I had last year. And it's just a quick story for you guys, okay? So bear with me. Phones, social media. I was having probably like one of the worst times in my life last year over summer. And I couldn't figure out why at all. Other than the fact that I was reading things that were most people my age don't read and freaking himself out like 24/7, but I'm okay. Anyways, I would wake up in the morning and I would go on Instagram. First thing, in bed. Would not pray, would not make my bed, wouldn't do anything other than go right on my phone. One day, and I would do that for probably 30-40 minutes a day. One day, I woke up, and this is months down the line, I woke up and I was on my phone for like 2.5 hours or something, and I didn't even realize that 2.5 hours went by. I knew I had the day off, I knew I didn't have anything to do. I decided, okay, I'm just gonna relax. It was like, I got sucked into my phone and was not able to get out. Then, I caught myself. I had a horrible day the rest of the day. Horrible day. And I wondered why. I wasn't able to get my head quiet, I wasn't able to focus on anything, I was in such a bad mood. And it was because, I put it to this, I absorbed all of that other information that was not mine at the beginning of the day. They say what you do at the beginning of the day is how you're likely going to end the day. And like from that moment on, like I literally told myself I will never go on Instagram first thing in the morning again. I pretty much have not. I've done it maybe like once or twice since then, and it's changed my life. Like I literally, it was probably one of the biggest changes I've made in my life at 20 years old so far. Was choosing not to go on it like in the morning, and like it started leading me into not going on my phone in the morning. It started leading me into going on my phone less throughout the day. But like, it was crazy how that one, like, you don't think of it as an addiction. I was doing it every day for 30 minutes a day, the first thing I do in the day. And it was filling myself up with everybody else's stuff and not mine.
Yeah, how many times do we look at our phone a day? Do you ever do that? Just count how many times you just like glance at your phone?
It's really crazy.
It's kind of creepy when you get into it.
So I'm just going to say, it just takes that noticing of it. Like the awareness is like the number one thing. Awesome. Once you're aware of it, you got it.
Conquer that addiction. Alright guys, hey, thank you guys so much. By the way, Saturday, pool party, if you guys want to come to my place, 11 o'clock.
Kevin's birthday.
My birthday's not, it's next week actually, so we'll be doing a talk on skin. I'll be 34, walking 34. Right? Alright.